more somber.
I'm trying to sound professional. I guess.
Okay. All right.
But I can stop.
I'm not going
Makes
to.
you uncomfortable.
Yeah, we're back again with the Cinema Discovery Project. How's it been? I mean, are you still like drowning in money from Endgame? Endgame's just like, are there any other movies playing right now?
There are.
I think every theater is Endgame right now.
That is very true. Every theater is Endgame right now, and it's been out for what, 3 weeks?
Almost
2.5
3 weeks. Almost 3 weeks, I think.
Yeah, I lose count of time after a while.
You know what's I'm ready for is John Wick 3.
That's this week. John Wick 3 is this week. As of this recording, it's in a few days. And then I didn't even realize this, but the live action Aladdin comes out the following week. And for some reason, I thought that was a summer, like deep summer movie.
Yeah.
I don't know why I thought it was a May movie. But I keep seeing a lot of build up for it online. A lot of trailers keep dropping, a lot of marketing for it. And I guess Disney, you don't really need to put that much into marketing these movies. They're already built in. They're already in the psyche. I mean, don't waste your money, but whatever, if you got money to burn, you got money to burn. But yeah, it seems like it feels like it's only been 2 weeks since we recorded last, but it feels like a little longer. I don't know why.
Well, I mean, we're a little bit behind. We're a day behind, but other than that, I mean, you got so much going on in our outside of this podcast. It just
that's very true. Like life just kind of takes over, and you just end up drifting with it, I guess. Like
you've been watching a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I've been watching a lot of things. Coincidentally, I was on a documentary kind of kick recently where I just went and watched a lot of documentaries that I had just been putting off for years.
Yeah.
Things like 20 Feet from Stardom, which won the Oscar a few years ago. Stories We Tell, the documentary by the actress Sarah Polley, who's now turned filmmaker. Minding the Gap, which came out last year.
Yeah.
Which was, I believe, an Oscar nominee.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, it lost to the rock climbing movie, which was fantastic.
Free Solo.
And then I watched Apollo 11, the new documentary.
I've heard that's great.
The Apollo 11. It is fantastic. They've taken all of this real footage and made it epic. You know what I mean? Made it very cinematic, and you kind of have to be a big fan of, space exploration and all that kind of stuff to really dive into it. But if you are, it's pretty great. And there've been so many documentaries about the Apollo missions, and specifically Apollo 11, which is the first one where we landed on the moon. Well, according to some we did, according to some we didn't. But when you're watching this footage, it's really hard not to believe that we did in fact land on the moon. Some of this footage is incredible. Just amazing. I've always been a big fan of space and space exploration. But getting into our main topic of the week, we might as well dive into it if we're talking about things we love. And that is the independent cinema movement of, what would you call it, Steven? The 80s, the 90s?
The late 80s, late 80s into the 90s, independent cinema has its ebbs and flows,
right.
Even from early in the 40s and 50s and stuff like that. But, specifically we want to talk about, which is very near and dear to us because this is kind of when we grew up, is through this movement, and these filmmakers are still kind of having an effect today. Some of them are still kind of playing in the independent realm. Some of them have kind of graduated up into higher budget filmmaking.
That is true.
But a lot of them are still on the ground floor, man. They're still doing their thing.
Yeah, and it's very interesting where we pinpoint these group of filmmakers because for me, I'm always compartmentalizing historical movements or moments, like how does one flow into the next one, or who is the next generation after this generation. And specifically for me, where this generation of 80s and 90s filmmakers came from is kind of born in the late 70s with the Sundance Film Festival being founded. Now, it wasn't called the Sundance Film Festival until like 1991, but we always just call it that because it's a cooler, easier name to call it.
Yeah.
No, I think it was called the the Utah U.S. Film Festival or something.
Yeah, that's
like
gross.
that.
That's gross. I don't like it.
It's too official. It's way too official, too bureaucratic, and it was very non-bureaucratic. It was a place to make not only people aware of the Utah being a very beautiful place to shoot movies, but also kind of championing independent cinema and giving independent cinema a place to showcase the films. Basically, the Sundance Institute now is in place where filmmakers can get grants and use facilities and do all kind of stuff to make movies. They distribute some films as well. It's very, very interesting how that has grown, and how just the festival circuit in general has grown to be an international thing. You know what I mean? The Cannes Film Festival has been around for many, many decades, and that was, that's a big prestige one. It still is rather a big prestige one, but you get these smaller ones like Sundance, like Telluride, which Steven went to last year, and you've got South by Southwest. Tribeca Film Festival is also one that was founded much later, though. That was founded, I think, by Robert De Niro in after 9/11. I think he founded that. But that place, I always think of Tribeca as kind of like an educational one. That's the one where they have all these panels and talks and these reunions. I don't know if it was last year or the year before, they had a reunion for the cast of Heat, and and then they put that on the anniversary edition Blu-ray for Heat. I think Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro go there all the time and talk about it because they're New York. People.
Yeah.
That's their place. But anywho, Sundance Film Festival, like I said, is a place that's still around where people submit their films and are looking for distribution. Essentially,
it's usually the first big independent film thing of the year.
Yeah,
because it comes out early in the year.
February. It's usually January, February, somewhere around there. And I don't know if you know this, but it is very, very cold there that time of year in Utah.
It's kind of one, even though it's one of the considered one of the premier independent film festivals. It's and it's a beautiful place during that time of the year, but it's freaking cold. It's crazy. I mean, I would love to go one day, but honestly, I have a feeling it wouldn't be as great of an experience as I had at Telluride, where it was warmer and it was.
I know people who go there every year. Alicia Malone goes there almost every year, and she always had these great vlogs of her walking through these snowy streets late at night after screenings, where it's single digit degrees and it's snowing, torrentially snowing, and I'm like, I love movies, but getting frostbite scares the heck out of me. You know what I mean?
I'm sure it's a little easier when you're kind of a special guest of the festival.
Well, I think she goes as press. You know what I
mean?
mean?
That's what I'm saying, but still,
press passes and stuff
she's
like
known there. She's going to get a lot more benefits.
You still got to walk through the snow, though.
Sure,
it's
but
cold.
I mean,
I think it's sometimes because it's in the mountains, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
So sometimes you got to where you're staying versus where the village is. You got to take one of those ski lift things, and
she probably is able to get a place in the town, I'm sure.
I don't think there are any places in town. I think it's just the cinema and stuff. I don't know. I have no idea.
If it's Telluride, there's a place in town.
Yeah.
I mean,
I have no idea how it's structured. All I know is every single year it's a big event for independent cinema.
Oh yeah.
A lot of people go there for to get distribution. You get a lot of interviews with a lot of people. And what's interesting though is independent cinema has grown so much now that it's not only the obscure directors or the obscure actors and actresses trying to make their way up in the world. Sometimes it's very much mainstream people that you've seen who happen to be in smaller movies. And now these smaller movies, indie, I'm using quote, indie budgets aren't what they used to be. Indie budget for me can be anything from thousands of dollars to 10, 15, 20 million. That seems to be the range of, quote, indie budget movies, at least in my opinion, because you see that very often. And we always talk about, the mid-range, the loss of the mid-range budget films. And it's very interesting where the low budget kind of cuts off and the mid-range takes over. And it's getting to the point where you don't really know where those lines are anymore. It's just like everything just keeps growing and growing over time, the way economics work and whatnot. But specifically for this independent movement, some of the names that have come out of it, before, because we really want to highlight a lot of these people. And it's big names that you wouldn't have, that you wouldn't necessarily believe that they started out in such a small realm. People like Quentin Tarantino, David O. Russell, Paul Thomas Anderson, Steven Soderbergh, James Wan, Jim Jarmusch is kind of still in that indie realm.
Richard Linklater.
Richard Linklater started off in this whole independent cinema movement. I don't know if he was specifically in the Sundance realm, but I know he's from that generation.
Yeah.
Kevin Smith is another one from that generation, one of my favorites. And like I said, it kind of all started in the late 70s and kind of morphed into the 80s, and we got to the 90s. But for me, this kind of new indie film movement came after the new Hollywood movement of the late 60s and 70s, which had gigantic names.
Yeah, I mean a lot of what happened was is the independent players of that time created the blockbuster.
What happened is
your Spielbergs and your Lucases changed independent cinema again, and because Star Wars is an independent movie.
Really? Yeah. I mean, what is interesting is they kind of brought their independent small movie style to Hollywood, to the mainstream.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And a lot of the generation after them learned from watching their movies. You know what I mean? It's like they graduated up from their world of indie films, which happened to be, maybe like Roger Corman B movies that Coppola did and Scorsese did, and Steven Spielberg, isn't his first movie was a TV movie. Duel is a TV movie. And, they graduated up into, working for 20th Century Fox, Universal, Warner Brothers, all these big corporations, Paramount and whatnot. And then the next generation took a different path to get to the mainstream. They took an independent cinema movement and kind of had great success there. And then kind of like the whole movement then shifted into the mainstream. It's weird, and I'm going to kind of break it down for you. Basically, we have the big studios that we all know of today. Disney, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, Paramount, Universal. Well, 20th Century Fox kind of doesn't exist anymore. But anyway, that's a different story.
Yeah.
It kind of doesn't exist anymore.
We don't have to talk about that.
Yeah, Sony Pictures, Columbia.
Columbia, yeah.
Columbia was around until Sony bought it in the early 90s, coincidentally.
MGM was still around.
MGM is still around, kind of, but it's owned by,
It's owned by Warner Brothers, I think.
It's owned by some conglomerate group somewhere, I don't know. Anywho, but all of these independent other studios, smaller studios, cropped up, and a lot of them still exist today, but they've now become subsidiaries of the bigger people.
Yeah, I mean, the two major players of that time were New Line and Miramax.
Yeah, and even Castle Rock, I guess, to a certain extent. Yeah. Coincidentally, both New Line and Castle Rock are both subsidiaries of Warner Brothers now. Yeah. Miramax was bought by Disney at one point, and now Miramax kind of doesn't... It exists, but... It doesn't have anything to do with Disney anymore. It's owned by some other company. It kind of went the way of like a lot of corporations go. That kind of just changes hands over time and it kind of just goes away. I really want to see who actually owns Miramax now. But Disney owned it for a while. But that company was founded by the Weinsteins. Harvey Weinstein, that piece of trash human being. Yeah. Bob Weinstein, his brother. It was founded in like 1979, so it's it was part of that whole movement too. It is, man. I'm trying to see. It's a subsidiary of somebody.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a subsidiary of somebody now.
Yeah, these studios started out independent and and as when they had their big successes, right. For instance with Miramax, it was Sex, Lies, and Videotape.
Yeah, that was a big one.
From Soderbergh. That was a big success for them, and then they had like Pulp Fiction come out.
Yes.
And they got very popular, and then when they got popular, then the big companies wanted to buy them out.
Yes, they did.
And that's just how business is. But it's perpetual. Nowadays all these these independent studios that are now bought by the bigger companies, but now you got new independent studios cropping up like A24.
Right.
It's a cycle. There's always going to be another player in town.
But what is interesting though is that's kind of what if you're at that time, if you're one of these small studio companies, and one, you want to have success, but two, you also want to make money, and there's no bigger money than being bought out by a bigger company. That's kind of what you want.
I mean, that's kind of what you're looking for, a big payout, a big payday.
Yeah, basically, essentially what happened is these big studios saw, man, these independent companies, they're starting to make some money, so we gotta do stuff like they do. So they started not only scooping up like New Line and Castle Rock and Miramax, but they started making their own like independent, subsidiaries within their own companies, and that's when you get Sony Pictures Classic, which has been around since 1992. Fox Searchlight, we all know Fox Searchlight.
Yeah. Paramount.
Paramount Vantage was one that went defunct in 2013. Focus Features came out a little later, and that's part of Universal. They came out around 2002. And then the Warner Independent Pictures was the small one that was from like 2003 to 2008. But they, like I said, they have New Line. They've got Castle Rock. I think is it Roadshow or something like that? There's a bunch of these. You got to look up all. It's like a one of those big like family tree charts where it's like, here's the main patriarch or matriarch up top, and this is how that person's related. This is how that person's related.
And I mean, shit. There's a lot of film filmmakers and actors that all have their own little studios, little production companies. They go on forever. I mean, like Brad Pitt's got Plan B.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, A Bad Robot is J.J. Abrams. And what happens is
and I think he's selling Bad Robot.
Oh,
I think I heard that. Yeah.
I wonder how much he's selling it for. We should team
I'm sure
up,
it's going to go for. I bet you. I think I can scrounge up enough money.
Yeah, I know.
We'll buy it.
Sell our souls to the devil or whomever.
Yes. I'll do it.
Basically, what happens is a lot of times these smaller production companies team up with other production companies to fund a film.
I mean, shit. I mean, weren't the Lord of the Rings movies partially produced by New Line Cinema?
God, the Lord of the Rings films, if you look at those credits, Wingnut is Peter Jackson's company, I believe, but it was also New Line. MGM was in there. The Weinsteins initially had the rights to it, like back in the 90s when they wanted to make it like one film or like two films, but then they kind of bowed out, but they still had to have like credit on it and get some money because of rights issues. Man, if you want to go down a weird rabbit hole of like rights issues, it's interesting but complicated as heck.
That's what lawyers are for.
That's what lawyers are for, and it's really, really interesting film production wise when you see all of those credits at the beginning of a movie, and it's just all of these different company names that keep flashing up at you. They all have their hands in the film somehow, whether it's active, whether it's really active, or whether it's just throwing money at a project. But that's how kind of independent films are made. It's very much a group effort of getting these small production companies together to make a movie, or just one will get the funding from somewhere, and then you take it to a Sundance, a South by Southwest, a Telluride, someplace, Cannes, wherever, and you look for distribution, because that's the key in...
You want to get it to as many eyes as possible, yeah.
Yeah, the key with independent cinema is to get your movie picked up for distribution so it can be seen, and you can actually start making money on it, because up until that point, you're just sinking money into a project and not making anything from it.
Yeah, and before this indie boom in the 90s, independent cinema was kind of just something that very few people could get their eyes on, but then when it started to have its boom, you started to see like more art cinema, art theaters, and more of these places where even the common person could go see these movies.
Yeah, it's really only been within the last, probably since this boom, that you can actually see independent films, well, most independent films in multiplexes or in art house cinemas, like you said. Before then, there wasn't a lot of
not a lot of access,
not a lot of distribution. I mean, sometimes some big companies would pick up a film and then distribute it, like a Paramount would pick.
Well, the thing is during this time we were having the boom of home media. You were getting This was as they call it, the VHS generation.
Yeah, the 80s.
Yeah, so you could see these movies eventually. You would probably not hear about them until they came out on VHS.
Yeah. Well, the home video market, the home rental market, it was a huge bubble in the 80s and 90s. The Blockbusters of the world and all these other rental places that now really don't exist. They just kind of morphed into the digital era with Netflix and Hulu and Amazon, iTunes, etc., etc. That's where you rent your movies now. It's very interesting how independent cinema has evolved from that point. Now, a lot of independent films don't even go to cinemas anymore. They're looking for distribution in other areas. Digital distribution, Netflix, like I said, or even Amazon or anything like that. There's
but see, now with that, and I know we're delving down a rabbit hole.
The rabbit hole.
But even with that, there's the conversation of, even when you're seeking digital, now you're just putting yourself in just such a big pool of saturation, where you might not even though it's so accessible, that there's so much crap out there that you won't even be seen.
That's true.
It's almost now that the reverse is the better play, even though it's the harder play. You got to work harder to get theatrical distribution so that you have a better chance of people actually seeing it, because there's not so much saturation.
Yeah. But I mean, if the end goal is to make money, or
sure, if you're wanting to make money,
if you want to make money, take the best deal take the deal you can find.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Take the deal you can get. But kind of reeling things back a little bit, because I tend to go down alleyways.
Yeah,
get back
on the 90s scene.
I want to talk about some of the specifically some of the filmmakers that came out of this era and how different they are from one another, and kind of why were their films popular enough for them to become, household names.
And where are they
now?
About them?
And where are they now? So I don't know. I like to start with one of the early ones. For me, Steven Soderbergh, I think, is one of the early ones. Sex, Lies, and Videotape came out in the late 80s, and that was a big hit at Sundance. And that came out in 1989. And
the year of my birth.
The year of Steven's birth. So an important year, I guess.
Yes.
And it's a film, to me, that when I first watched it, I loved it. I've watched it several times since, and I still really like it. It's so small. The things with a lot of these first films from some of these directors, they're so small in scope, but what they're saying and what they're showing us is very wide. It's very macro. It's saying so much.
There's also another element to this that is what it takes, is a part of what makes this movement stand out, and that is the technology too. Like film, the cameras and things. The technology was changing, and people were getting more. You were getting more access to that stuff too.
It was still tough. I remember. I remember. I mean, if you want to see a movie that's made on a shoestring budget, you watch something like Robert Rodriguez's El Mariachi.
Yeah.
I think it was made for a couple of $1,000s, and the way he was doing it was just like guerrilla style filmmaking down to the bone. Like, he was recording audio on cassette tapes. You know what I mean? And he was doing this is the era of kind of video cameras where you would record things on videotape and things like that, where film was too expensive. That's why a lot of people went digital, because film was just so expensive. Especially if you're a young filmmaker in his early 20s and you don't have any real connection to the film business or anything like that. You've got to rent, you got to find equipment in any way you can, and the cheapest stuff was 16 millimeter was stuff instead of 35 millimeter, or sometimes you would have to shoot in black and white. The reason why Clerks is in black and white is because it was
cheaper.
16 millimeter black and white. That movie was made for $29,000, and Kevin Smith put it all on a credit card. That's how he paid for it. You know what I mean? And it was shot like at the Quick Stop he worked at. You know what I mean? El Mariachi was shot, in places that Robert Rodriguez had access to, and he was like, and the way he shot that movie, he's just like, he basically tells people it was just things I had access to. Like in the opening shot of that movie, there's like a turtle crossing the road or something like that, and it's like, yeah we just found a turtle and we just shot it. You know? What I mean, like, that's how it is.
One of the main elements I really have an appreciation for the filmmakers of this time is that they basically had to become, knowledgeable in all aspects of making movies, because like somebody like Robert Rodriguez also edits a lot of his films.
Yeah, he's very hands-on.
Very hands-on. He probably even handles the camera himself a lot of times.
Yeah, he's really involved. And like going back to Sex, Lies, and Videotape.
Well, Soderbergh, does a lot of cinematography. That was probably
the most like professional of like one of these early filmmakers. He and Quentin Tarantino had a more professional vibe to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the sense like these weren't well-known actors at the time. Especially specifically Sex, Lies, and Videotape. But they were professional actors. You know what I mean? Like these weren't like local actors or anything like that.
Yeah.
These were real
they were
actors.
faces you might know. Yeah.
Reservoir Dogs. If you that cast, Harvey Keitel. He worked with Scorsese. Steve Buscemi, I believe at that point, had already worked with the Coen brothers a little bit. He had been around. You had
Tim Roth.
Tim Roth was in that film. You had Michael Madsen was in that film. You had you had some names in there, but someone like Kevin Smith or Robert Rodriguez, these were no-name actors. The Kevin Smith, I know specifically on Clerks, those were kind of just like local actors that were in it. I mean, and his friends were in it. His friends showed up like to play multiple characters in different parts of the movie. It was very, very interesting, the making of that movie. But El Mariachi is interesting as well because I remember there's this book called, oh man, I have to look it up. But it's the book. It's a book by Robert Rodriguez about filmmaking. Rebel Without a Crew. That's what it's called.
Yeah.
And it's just a diary of his filmmaking process. And like he went and like submitted himself for like those like psychological experiments where like they'll like drug testing or something like that,
like a stress test kind of thing.
Maybe they're testing a drug, like a like something like that, and they need like human people to sign up to do it, or they'll do psychological testing by putting people in scenarios or locking people away or whatever it is. Anywho, he signed up for stuff like that to get money for this movie, to make El Mariachi. You know what I mean? Like it's real down and dirty type stuff to get things done. Very, just fascinating stuff. That movie ended up being a big hit. It ended up being bought by, I believe, Sony at the time.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and then he went on to make Desperado, which is basically a continuation of El Mariachi. It's mostly a remake of El Mariachi.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's
with a bigger budget.
Yeah, it's kind of like something like with Hitchcock, where Hitchcock remade some of his movies.
Yeah,
because he had better better budgets for them.
Yeah, essentially. And through someone like Robert Rodriguez, he brought in actors like Selma Hayek. He discovered her. Antonio Banderas started with him, and he became
Danny Trejo.
Danny Trejo. I mean, another one.
Somebody that just won't go away. He's in everything.
That's true. But another kind of other actors who cropped up, both Kevin Smith and Richard Linklater, kind of started the career of Ben Affleck.
Yeah,
Ben Affleck was in Dazed and Confused, which I think is his first film role, as well as Matthew McConaughey is in there as well, and that's McConaughey's first film role as well. And Kevin Smith kind of used Ben Affleck.
Was Dazed and Confused before Texas Chainsaw 2?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. I know. Yeah, very interesting. Coincidentally, Renee Zellweger was in Dazed and Confused. She's the girl who walks by, and then Matthew McConaughey has that famous line, the one thing I like about those high school girls is I get older, they stay the same age. It's actually really creepy in hindsight. But the girl that walks by right before he says that is Renee Zellweger.
Yeah.
And Renee Zellweger is in Texas Chainsaw New Generation or whatever it was.
Yeah.
With Matthew McConaughey. A very weird connection there. But all these actors at the time are just trying to find work, so you get what you can get. But Ben Affleck was in Mallrats. He was in Chasing Amy. He was in Dogma. He was even in Jay and Silent Bob.
Apparently they had a falling out.
They had a falling out like in somewhere in the 2000s, I think, where I think that just Kevin Smith just, I guess, said some stuff that Ben Affleck didn't want him to say, and then they kind of had. Like,
I've heard that there might be a reconciliation soon.
Maybe. I don't know.
We'll see. There needs to be.
There does need to be, but Ben Affleck, was a huge star in the early 2000s, but he got his start during this independent cinema movement. And you got, and the difference in these directors, kind of want to backtrack and get into there, like Steven Soderbergh really, I think, relies on dialogue. And
he's a very
writer.
I was gonna say meticulous writer.
Sex Lies and Videotape. Really strong thematic film, at least in my opinion. Really strong film. Like I said, very professional, well done film, but very small. And then he did King of the Hill, which was talk about another person who was in that movie. That was that's a young actor, is Jesse Bradford. He went on to be in a few things, but he graduated up to making larger movies like Traffic, Ocean's 11, Erin Brockovich.
12,
13, he did do that. But he's someone who has still stayed in that indie realm specifically, and he's someone who coincidentally got fed up with the distribution game, the
studio
a few years
system
ago.
Yeah.
He was at the San Francisco Film Festival, and he had this great speech. You can find it on YouTube and Vimeo and places like that, where he just basically tells you how big of a pain in the ass it is to get distribution in the modern age through the studio system. He was just like, I'm done doing it. And then he kind of quote unquote retired, but he has since come back.
I mean, now he's making movies on cell phones and he's
now he's making movies on cell phones and stuff like that.
He's trying to push what it means to make in this new age of everybody having a camera. Trying to show you what you can do with just a camera in your pocket.
Pretty much,
which shows
cool.
a lot of talent, but
it's tough.
I make some movies on a real camera, man.
Someone who didn't really quite graduate to the mainstream, big budget film world, studio world, is Richard Linklater. He's always stayed in that indie realm.
He kind of comes back. He comes out every once in a while.
But even his successful movies aren't big budgeted.
Well, they're not big, but no, they're not big budget. But
like Boyhood wasn't a big budgeted movie.
Well, no, but School of Rock was
School of Rock was more mainstream.
Yeah,
because it had Jack Black in it, who was kind of a bigger star at the time, and it had but Joan Cusack is kind of in the indie, has always been in the indie.
Well, no,
realm.
it's a mid-budget movie.
Yeah, it's a mid-budget movie. But he's never done like, I don't know.
No, he's never come out and done some superhero movie or anything like that.
No, or anything like $100 million or anything like that. No. You know what I mean? And he's always stayed in that realm, and he's had an eclectic group of films, I think, for me. But he's always stayed with very meaningful films.
He's probably my favorite director of this time period.
Yeah, man. Yeah. The reason why is, the Before trilogy, I think, is something amazing. On another level. I would even say Slacker is one of the most important
Slacker is a very important movie out of that time period.
In that time period, because it's a movie, you probably have heard this many, many times, it's a movie about nothing, and it's also a movie about everything.
You thought really Seinfeld was the one that started that. No.
Yeah, it's not. It's just a movie, and it's the way it's shot and the way it's done is there's no plot to it. It's just people, it's just a camera following people. And it just follows one person walking down the street, and then it'll just all of a sudden start following the next person in and out of buildings, in and out of places, scenarios. It's so interesting how it's able to get a cross section of a population.
Yeah, and what you can see is the kind of the thing that's a running theme here with these filmmakers is that the writing is what makes these movies great.
Yeah,
they're all writers before they are directors, essentially. But
and that's one of the things that you can knock not even knock, but like some of the early films. There's not a lot of great flourishes when it comes to cinematography or things like that. It's kind of just, the dialogue carries the movie.
Very raw. They're very raw movies.
For some of them. Someone like Tarantino, he's always had the stylized flourishes because he's taken all of those visual cues from the things he loved watching when he was younger. Even in Reservoir Dogs that's there, but it's definitely in Pulp Fiction, and so on and so on. But someone like for example, Kevin Smith, if you watch Clerks, the camera there's not a lot of editing. There's not a lot of movement. Not a lot of movement. Everything is done in basically 2 shots where just 2 people talking. It's a very stripped down version of filmmaking that is a very indie, almost, film school version of filmmaking. And some of these, some of these filmmakers went to film school and some of them didn't. Yeah. Quentin Tarantino famously never went to film school, or he did and then he dropped out after like a week or something.
He took some workshops, I think, but other than that he didn't really go to some 4-year thing or
no, like a USC or a UCLA.
No, I think he took some workshops after he made his first it was like with The Best Friend, whatever it's called.
Right.
He made some movie before he made Reservoir Dogs.
Yeah, and I know, but I know that I'm pretty sure Linklater went to a small Texas college, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
I think Robert Rodriguez went to University of Texas, and I think he went to film school, but I know that, I think so, don't quote me on this, but I know Richard Linklater has some type of background in philosophy, because his especially his early films dealt a lot with philosophy.
Yeah. A lot of his movies have to do with time. They're dealing with themes of time and
time and romance and human connection. That's a lot of what was great about some of these filmmakers is these films felt very human, very
they're more personal filmmakers, and that's what and even today, that's what independent cinema does a lot, is that they bring it to a more personal level instead of films that are all about story and mythology and plot and things like that,
Right. You get a lot more, you're able to connect with the audience on a much more human level, so they're able to feel like they're participating in the movie, as opposed to watching an action movie where they could never do any of these things, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Let's watch the 8th Fast and the Furious film. Let's see cars jump between buildings and shit. Yeah, I can relate to that.
Who can't?
I know.
Oh, man. It's very interesting how, to see where a lot of these directors' careers went, and they're all still pretty relevant, like we've said.
For the most part, yeah.
For the most part. I mean, I would say Quentin Tarantino is probably the most well-known
probably
out of all of them. I know Paul Thomas Anderson, though, when it comes to cinephiles, he's pretty godlike, if you will.
He's maybe the best.
Him
and Linklater are the 2 best, I think, out of that time.
Yeah. Just thinking about it, you're kind of right. I was going to say something else, but I couldn't remember what it was.
Soderbergh, of course, is kind of godlike to independent people, too.
The thing with Soderbergh, though, is I'm so surprised at just the sheer volume of films he's put out.
Yeah.
It's the complete opposite of someone like Tarantino, who has only done, 9 films so far?
Well, yeah, but you know how he is, man. He's all about his legacies.
Yeah, he's all about taking time. He's very nuanced. For me, Soderbergh is kind of like he's gonna do it. He's gonna do it now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like he has a more sense of urgency, if you will.
And then somebody like Kevin Smith kind of just if he feels like making something today, he might try to do it. For me,
Kevin Smith has always been someone I've admired greatly for him as a person than I have necessarily for his work.
I was gonna say I like his personality. I like his personality more than I like him as a filmmaker.
He's very human, and he's very honest. That's the one thing about him that I've always loved is his honesty. Like he says like, yeah, Mallrats is not a good movie because I didn't know what I was doing at the time because I just made Clerks and then Universal gave me like $10 million and like he was like, the only thing I knew at the time was to make a movie with my friends, and that's what he did was make Mallrats into a movie with his friends. And the thing with his early films is it was all personal films to him. Clerks was, you know, he worked as a clerk. He was a mall rat, someone who hung out at a mall. Chasing Amy was something that, a relationship that he was kind of almost going through. But actually it was more Scott Mosier who was his partner. He was going through that, but it was also a combination of both things that were happening at the time. There's a great documentary called Tracing Amy. That's the making of Chasing Amy. That's on the Blu-ray. It's really fantastic. That movie was another low-budgeted film, but I think that movie thematically is very interesting when it comes to human romantic relationships and people's self-doubt getting in the way of true romantic happiness. And just their own stupidity getting in, their own insecurities taking over their lives. But then after that, he made Dogma, which was his kind of religious film because he grew up in that religious world. But then, you know, he kind of did Jay and Silent Bob to try to connect this whole View Askew universe. But then after that was when he tried to go mainstream with big budget, and it just didn't work. He was making movies that weren't comfortable for him.
The thing is I like I said, I'm not as huge of a fan of him as a fan.
I'm a big fan. You can tell. I'm trying to like.
I can tell you. You really like his.
Well, the thing is, I've studied
films,
I studied his work, and it's only like now that he's going back to his roots with making movies like Tusk and Yoga Hosers that he's.
I do like Tusk.
Tusk is actually a great dark comedy. I watched it first time as like a serious movie, and then I watched it a second time as if it was a dark comedy, and it plays very well as a dark comedy.
Yeah.
When he went his more serious route with Red State's a crazy movie. That's more horror than anything. But he is but like, yet again, he's been more of an inspiration for me because of his honesty, because of where he started from. You know, he was a suburb kid from New Jersey who collected comic books and like Batman. That's where his origins start. That's relatable to me.
Sure.
As opposed to somebody who, you know, went to like USC or went to NYU. That's not really something I can relate to because I didn't go to film school. You know what I mean? Or anything like that. But he went to film school, but it was like a 1-year program.
Yeah. Got the basics, maybe some basics
gives you a degree,
down.
You know what I mean? But someone like that PTA we've talked about, I think
there's one person we've forgotten, Spike Lee.
Spike Lee was, that's interesting because he started kind of right in the middle of the 80s.
Yeah.
And he went to NYU, and his films are independent films. Yeah. By the time the 90s came around, I think he had started to go more mainstream because I think of Malcolm X.
I guess as mainstream as you can get with him, but I mean.
Yeah, he's always been in the indie realm. You are right. Spike Lee is a great example of starting off early because he and even someone, I'm going to bring up a name here that Ang Lee, is another one kind of in this world who came up at this time. And Ang Lee and Spike Lee were actually at NYU together at the same time in college, in film school. And I think that's how they knew each other from there. And very interesting how they emerged. Another kind of thing that kind of emerged in the late 80s and into the 90s was a director by the name of John Woo.
Yeah.
John Woo started off making these amazing Hong Kong action films, and basically Hollywood saw how people were reacting to them and how successful they were, and they brought him over to make his own Americanized versions of those movies. So he kind of got taken from the international indie realm, where he was working with an actor many people probably know, Chow Yun-fat. He started there, and he started making Americanized versions of his movies, like I said, and some good,
Death
some bad.
Warrant.
Some good, some bad for John Woo.
Not Death Warrant. I'm sorry. Hard Target was the one he did.
Hard Target was his first American movie, and then he did Broken Arrow, which I just don't like, with Travolta and Christian Slater.
But he did do Face Off.
He did do Face Off, which some people love, some people don't.
You should all love it, guys.
That movie's crazy. That movie has like a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's
Take his face
off. Oh, man. Nick Cage, talk about somebody coming out of the indie realm. In the 80s, when he was kind of a nobody, because, he's the nephew of Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah.
When he started out his career, I think he started out with the credits as Nick Coppola, because he was in Fast Times at Ridgemont High as one of like the high school kids in the background or whatever, and he was like credited as Nick Coppola, but he didn't get he kind of started in the indie realm doing a Coen Brothers film.
I was going to say we haven't brought up the Coen Brothers.
Coen Brothers started in the indie world as well, where they started off with Blood Simple, which is an amazing first film. A lot of these first films by some of these directors are fantastic. Like, you watch them and you're like...
Hard Eight from PTA.
Hard Eight from PTA, which still to this day doesn't have a Blu-ray release here in the United States. I thought we were getting a Criterion release for this like 5 or 6 years ago, and we haven't gotten anything yet. And I still have my DVD on my shelf. That's a movie... That's a really great movie. I think it's a fantastic movie. Another person I want to bring up, the Coen Brothers, outside of the Coen Brothers, and now I can't remember. No, I'll move on.
Oh my god!
Because I couldn't remember.
Is it a person or is it a duo?
Well, we do have. There's a couple of other names we haven't mentioned here. Like David O. Russell started in the indie realm. I'm trying to remember what David O. Russell's had a very interesting career. He's only really gotten kind of success now.
He's gotten success over the last decade.
Yeah.
I mean, before that you had like I Heart Huckabee and like some really he worked with Ben Stiller a lot.
He did do Three Kings.
Yeah, Three Kings, but that was like 2000, early 2000s.
Yeah, Three Kings was like 1999.
Was it?
Yeah.
To be honest, I'm not very familiar with his 90s work.
He did do a movie called Spanking the Monkey. Which, look up the synopsis for that film. Flirting with Disaster, I've actually seen. I actually own it. It's pretty good, but he's only gotten notoriety over the last 10 years. What is interesting is apparently he's a very difficult director to work with.
I've heard that, yeah.
I've heard he's kind of an ass. Some of these directors are very difficult to work with. I've heard Tarantino is pretty demanding as a director, specifically when it comes to sticking with his script. The script is pretty much like his Bible, and he wants you to read it exactly, I guess, the way he wants it read, or else he'll fire you in the middle of the production. But yeah, there's been a lot of people. Oh, you know who I wanted to mention? Now I remember. Backtracking now, is John Singleton, who just passed away. He was someone who came from the indie realm as well with Boys in the Hood, which was an indie film that ended up getting picked up by distribution through Columbia Pictures / Sony in the early 90s, and he kind of stayed in the indie realm throughout most of his career, specifically in the 90s. A lot of those films were very social commentary films, specifically about the African American community and stuff like that. So he was another one who came up through there as well. This era, and just kind of to put a somewhat of a capper on this, so we don't go talking about this forever. And I kind of wanted to get a little personal here, because when I first started collecting DVDs around 2007, 8, 6, around there, the first stuff I picked up were from these directors. Were Pulp Fiction, Reservoir Dogs, the Clerks X DVD, Sex, Lies, and Videotape. I ended up picking up actually a few years later, but a lot of these were directors that I started picking up, and because these directors are a very good place to get into if you want to get into modern indie film. And this term, quote unquote, indie film, kind of only started in the 90s. You know what I mean? Like,
it's crazy to think about the fact that, there's, independent cinema has had its place throughout history,
right,
but these are probably the most accessible indie movies ever, like from these directors. Like, what place where there's movies sold do you not see Pulp Fiction sitting on the shelf?
Yeah,
you know,
they're in the mainstream. They were able to break through from the indie world, like the underground indie world, where you could, like, only a few people would know about this. Like, the cool people would know.
Yeah, I mean, like Dazed and Confused, you can see it in most places where you buy movies. Like,
yeah, like Pulp Fiction is such a big hit, right? You have to remember, Pulp Fiction was also nominated for Best Picture and and all that kind of stuff. I mean, remember that year was Shawshank Redemption, Pulp Fiction, and Forrest Gump. And Forrest Gump ended up winning. What's interesting is that Shawshank was a movie, I think, put out by Castle Rock. So that was an independent film as well. And that is by Frank Darabont, who...
That was his first movie.
That was his first movie. Imagine coming out of the gate with Shawshank. It's only downhill from here.
Kind of was, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he hasn't done many films afterward.
I think did 4 other movies, maybe.
Green Mile,
The Mist. That might be it.
That might be it.
I mean, he did a little bit of TV. But,
yeah, he did. He did a little of The Walking Dead, and then he got fired.
Yeah, and then since then, I don't really think he's done anything.
But yeah, so they were able to break through from the indie world to the mainstream world, and that's why they're remembered today. That's why you see, the posters up in people's rooms or wherever, and it's very interesting how accessible they've been to a mass audience. And because these aren't like mass appeal films either, these movies, like we said, very dialogue heavy. These aren't typically action films. Some of them did do action films, like Rodriguez did action films. Quentin Tarantino has done action, but Quentin Tarantino's early films, specifically his 90s work, they're not action movies. They're dialogue movies.
Oh, yeah.
Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, all dialogue. He really didn't do an action movie until he did this Kill Bill films. Basically, those are his action films. And then he did Death Proof, which was not quite an action movie, but yeah, kind of had action in it. Yeah.
Which he did with Robert Rodriguez.
But yeah, he did Planet Terror, and then
Grindhouse is the whole thing.
Coincidentally, man, there's a lot of connections here we're making. Grindhouse, just the Grindhouse movies and era, those were independent movies. Those B movies. Before kind of this boom that we're talking about, independent movies were kind of B movies. They were kind of, shitty movies, if you will. Bad acting and low production grade and all this kind of stuff. But these filmmakers were able to add a lot of prestige to it.
I mean, the independent of independence now is Troma.
Yeah, they're still around. They started in the 80s too, I think, with Toxic Avenger. Wasn't that like their first big thing?
It's their first big thing, yeah.
Yeah, in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, you had, like I said, underground midnight movie type stuff. Rocky Horror Picture Show. That's kind of an independent, B movie, if you will. But you also had the work from one of my favorite people ever on the planet, and that's John Waters.
John Waters. I know you guys said that.
John Waters is like he basically invented the midnight independent movie with just these trash movies, and I use trash in an endearing way, but they are like they're stuff like you could never get away with putting in a mainstream multiplex. You know what I mean? Things like Pink Flamingos and Multiple Maniacs and Female Trouble, Polyester, his whole filmography. You can't. It's so out there. My favorite is Cecil B. Demented. But yeah, he was another one kind of working in that underground way and never got to quite break through to the mainstream. Although
I'd love to see John Waters do a superhero movie.
Oh, so would I. It would be so much dirty sex in it. It'd be very interesting. But his big break and his main breakthrough, what mainstream wise, was both. I think Polyester was distributed by Paramount, but New Line distributed a lot of his stuff. That movie, now I can't remember. It's I coincidentally have it on my shelf, but it's his biggest breakthrough was his most mainstream work, and that was they remade it a few years ago with John Travolta and stuff like that. You remember what it was called? Hairspray.
Yeah, I was going to say Hairspray.
That's what it was. Yeah, Hairspray in the 80s was his big mainstream breakthrough, and that was his most, maligned film. Yet again, independent film.
Yeah.
But it wasn't quite, it didn't have quite a mainstream appeal. It's more of a cult movie. And that's another thing, like a lot of cult films were independent films. And a lot of cult films were also like, quote unquote bad movies. You know what I mean? Because they're like trash. You know what I mean? Things like Troll 2 and, Hobgoblins. Basically anything that was on like Mystery Science Theater 3000. All these trash B movies that you just sat and laughed at. I mean, at one of the worst like independent movies ever is hilarious and has a huge following in The Room.
The Room? Yeah.
The Room, yeah. It was completely independently funded and distributed by Tommy Wiseau.
We don't know where he got the money.
And written and directed by him, allegedly.
Yeah.
Allegedly. I don't know. Nobody knows where he got the money from.
No.
Nobody knows anything. All we know is that he broke every rule that you could ever do with filmmaking in terms of, like, having good acting, film production and having a good acting and writing. Oh, so awful.
It's rough.
Oh, but yeah, but independent cinema still perseveres today.
It is.
Although the market has shifted, like we've said, and they're not taking. How do I want to say this? The bigger studios are only getting bigger, and the smaller studios are kind of not growing with them. So the state of independent cinema going forward is still okay, but it could shrink. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, when there's less big studios, because Disney's buying up everything, they just took over Hulu, the controlling stock in Hulu now.
Right.
So now they control Hulu. They got Disney Plus. They're buying everything.
I'm not in those board meetings. I'm not in those rooms, but their concentration, at least from what we have seen, the big studio concentration from at least over the last couple of years is to make large budgeted films and reap money rewards.
Well, just any way to make money. I mean, they don't care about the art.
Yeah. Independent cinema doesn't necessarily make money. It may by make money, I mean, like, it's not making hundreds of millions of dollars. They'll make their money back and make a profit possibly, but they're not probably going to make $1 billion. You know,
Disney's not in film business to get accolades necessarily. They're not trying to make a stamp on film history other than stamping dollar bills. I mean, that's about it.
They got rid of, one of the independent subsidiaries within Fox 2000.
Yeah.
And that they distributed really not prestigious, but critically acclaimed, I guess would be a proper term. Fox 2000 Pictures, they released some really great films. I mean, they released, Bridge of Spies, but I mean, there's a lot of great films here. I'm just looking at a list. And now they no longer exist. They're no longer around. So what does that? Hidden Figures was one of their biggest releases. Love, Simon, was a really big hit from last year. Now they no longer exist. So what happens with all of those movies that were going to be made there? Where do they go now? Do they go to these other subsidiaries that already have their priorities because they're already taking in the work that they would take in no matter what? So now there's just kind of a lot of movies. My biggest fear is that there are a lot of movies that we would have seen that we won't be able to, that won't exist now because of this lack of focus of independent cinema because of the economics of it all, or because like they don't make money, or they're dead weight, or whatever the nonsense terms they want to throw at us. So that's my little rant about that.
Yeah. Well, we don't, now that we've you kind of went beyond the 90s area into today's economic problems within it. I think that's a good capper.
Yeah, it's a good place to end.
We talked about a little bit of all the filmmakers that are from that time period that are still kind of hitting us today with movies. And there are, of course, many more, but them were the major players. And I think that's a good stopping place. I mean, if you guys have any other filmmakers you want to throw at us that we didn't talk about, throw it in the comments.
Would you consider Christopher Nolan part of that realm of people?
I mean, obviously, technically, he made his first couple movies in the 90s, but it was like late 90s, and it was like, I don't know that I got the same, I don't feel the same flavor. I think he comes from a different, he's a little bit at the beginning of a new generation.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think he's part of the generation after that generation. And I bring that up because if you watch his movie Following, which came out, I want to say like 98 or so, I think on the Criterion, when there's an interview with him, was a big influence for him was he watched Clerks, and that was a big influence for him to be able to make movies, like have the ability to make movies. So yet again, that's someone learning from this generation of people to now go on to have an amazing career with amazing success in the mainstream realm, but starting out in his own independent field and expanding outward through that. So we're now like kind of like a generation past the generation we're talking about, and we're seeing a lot of them become very successful.
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
But
yes.
Yeah. Once again, let's not go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, come on.
I'm gonna reel you in. All right, so that's gonna be it for this episode of the Cinema Discovery Project. Hey, Andrew, where can you be found, man?
You can find me on Twitter at Capzilla06, as well as my YouTube channel, Capzilla Productions.
And you can find me on Facebook, Stephen Billings. You can also find me on Instagram under the title of this show, Cinema Discovery Project, throwing in all the goodies on there that I get. You can also find the audio for this podcast on Podbean, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. And that will be it for this episode of the Cinema Discovery Project. Thank you for listening, and hey, keep on watching them movies.
I know I will.